Hi, everyone. It's great to be here. I can't tell you how delighted I was to be asked by Working Mother to join you today. It's been an organization that I've admired for a number of years. I, too, am a working mother, and I've been fascinated by the research that you all produce about what makes a workplace more attractive to working women. What I find particularly interesting from some of the research that I've reviewed is the idea that whatever we find out about working mothers applies equally to working men and working fathers. And that's particularly true as we get into some of the younger generations of men. So what we're really doing by these explorations is not just helping women, but really helping human beings have a better work-life balance, be more effective in the workplace, and enjoy the work they do more. That's really essential. So congratulations on the work that you all do. There we go. What I'd like to do is start out by talking about some of the changes that we're experiencing. And if I were to ask you to think about a company that really reflects the last century, if you were going to tell your kids about the early 1900s and the companies that dominated industry at that time, what kinds of companies would we name? In most cases, most people come up with names like Ford or General Motors. I've had people say Sears and Roebuck, but basically companies that were able to solve what I propose was the major intellectual challenge for business in that last 100 years. And that was, how are we going to make a lot of stuff at a consistent quality and a reasonable cost? It was around issues of scale. How do we go from cottage industries and scale up to big organizations? And the organizations that mastered that became the icons that we all think of when we think of the last century. Now, if I also gave you a blank sheet of paper and asked you to design an organization that would optimize around cost, quality, and scale, I would propose that you design an organization very similar to some of the models we've grown up with historically. The idea of silos, in other words, people specializing, made a lot of sense. The idea of one person providing top-down instruction to everybody else made a lot of sense. But those models today are not going to create the iconic companies of the future. They're baseline skills. I'm not saying you don't still need to have quality and cost. Of course you do. But pretty much we all know how to do that. It won't set you apart. It won't differentiate you. So as we struggle with questions of how do we become the iconic companies of the next century, we're really forced to look at adopting new skills and excelling in new ways. I'd like to suggest that the iconic companies of the next century, this century, will be ones that are able to, in some way, mobilize intelligence, to get people to really give their all in terms of how they think about problems and invest their creativity and share what they have to know with other people in the workplace. It's going to be that sense of collaborating, of thinking, of digging deep to come up with creative ideas that will really drive us to the organizations that will be memorable and highly successful going forward. That requires having individuals in the workplace who are engaged, who feel good about their work, who want to come to work each day. It requires developing a wonderful workplace that will attract and engage the right people. What we're talking about is essentially what I like to call discretionary effort. The work that is most important to us today is increasingly work that we can't force people to do. We used to be able to force people to perhaps put things together on an assembly line in a specific way. We could watch them while we did it. But today, what we're asking people to do is stuff that we can't really even watch them do. You can always come watch me write a book, but I don't think you're going to get a lot of knowledge about how good that book's going to be until the end product. It's going to require my discretionary enthusiasm to put everything I've got into it that will really make that difference. So how do you get people to have that kind of feeling in your workplace? We're kind of like that movie about the baseball where you can build a work environment, but people won't necessarily show up with their whole selves, with their intense enthusiasm, unless it's a really great work environment that you've created. I wanted to, before I get into some specific suggestions, also give you a couple of numbers that I think remind us why we need to be so thoughtful about all the people that are in our workplace today. Because the reality is, even though we may feel a little distracted by the recession that we've all been kind of slogging out of, I hope, we are facing a growing talent shortage. Here are some numbers that show you the growth in the U.S. workforce over the last several decades. And what you can see from this is this huge growth in the workforce in the 1970s. That's the big bar on the left-hand side. That's when all the boomers jumped into the workforce with both feet. And since then, for the last 3 decades, we've continued to have double-digit growth. So we've kind of all grown up in a time when there was pretty heavy growth in the U.S. workforce. And the idea of, well, we don't need that guy, we'll just hire somebody new, was a pretty easy trap to fall into. But look at the last 2 bars. That's the decade of the 2010s and the decade of the 2020s. And you can see that the growth in our U.S. workforce will drop to the low single digits over a 10-year period. So in other words, in this 10-year period, stretching from now out to 2020, we're only going to have about a 4% growth in our U.S. workforce over the entire 10 years. Any of you who have aspirations of growing your companies, your employees, your population more rapidly than that are going to have to be really good. You're going to have to hire a disproportionate share of the available talent because there won't be that horde of people coming in. I also want to emphasize that this is in no way a U.S. phenomena. This is a problem that, in fact, extends around the globe. We're seeing a slowdown in the growth of the size of the workforce. So this chart, for example, shows you 40 years of history in the blue and 40 years of projected future in the red. Notice across the board, regardless of the country, that the future is much slower in terms of growth rate than the past. Now, that country that's way over on your left is Mexico. The Mexican working age population exploded over the last 40 years. It grew by 200% over a 40-year period. That, frankly, is a rate of growth that no country could reasonably be expected to accommodate in terms of industrial growth. And so there's very little mystery why we've had issues of illegal immigration from Mexico into the U.S. They were facing this massive population explosion. But look ahead. Over the next 40 years, the Mexican working age population will slow dramatically. It will grow by only about 20% over a 40-year period. That's a very modest rate of growth. Almost certainly, as Mexico comes out of the slowdown that it's experienced, it's going to be able to absorb its working age population. It's going to be able to accommodate the people that become available. I would suggest that the whole issue of illegal immigration, as an example, will be very different in 5 years, certainly in 10, probably right about the time they get that wall built down there. certainly by the time they get the electric wire up. Um, On the other hand, you can see countries who are actually shrinking. A lot of countries will be smaller over the next 40 years than they are today. So you see countries in Europe, you see Japan, etc., all of which will actually be smaller. So it's a global issue that we're facing. Now, the reason for that's pretty straightforward. We're having fewer kids. Birth rates are declining consistently around the world. Here you can see even in places like Africa, where we, frankly, still are above replacement levels. They're still having more than 2 children per woman. Nonetheless, the rates are coming down. Why? Why are we having fewer kids consistently around the world? What's going on? Come on. Women are working. Yes, that's part of it, big part of it. What else is going on? Birth control, yes, we have technology. What are kids in an agrarian society? Right, they're workers. They are, for those of you with a financial background, assets. Right? What are children in an industrial society? I hate to say it, we love those little darlings to pieces, but they are liabilities. They cost us money. Children undergo a shift on the great balance sheet of life from asset to liability as economies industrialize. And so what we're really seeing when we look at this chart is, in a sense, the rate of industrialization that's happening around the world. As countries industrialize, birth rates fall in a very predictable pattern. The point of that is we don't expect to see a reversal. We don't expect to see any country suddenly have hundreds, increase in the rate of birth. It's going down steadily as countries industrialize, even though some governments are trying to change it. Did you know, for example, that if you lived in Russia, you could get a free refrigerator if you conceived a child? That's the Russian government's approach to getting more growth in their population. And if you're looking for innovative workplace policies, they actually will give you a day off to do it. Yep, you can sign up for a conception day. I don't think any of those are going to dramatically reverse the trend. The net of that is we're going to have very slow growth of young people into our workplace going forward. Here's a picture of the U.S. We've isolated out here just the people who are 22 to 24, kind of looking at that college graduate level. And what you can see is a huge burst in the number of college-age graduates in the 70s when the boomers showed up, big growth. You see a little dip when the Xers showed up. You see a little tiny increase when the Ys showed up, just about bringing it back up to the level of the boomers, not much bigger, and then whoosh, flat. So again, my point, if your company strategy depends on hiring kids, if you want to hire 22 to 24-year-olds as a critical part of your strategy, you're going to have to be darn good, because the number of them is flat. You're going to have to hire a really disproportionate share in order to gain any sense of growth by hiring young people. Here's Europe, by the way. So you see a very different picture when you look at Europe, where the number is not just flat, it actually is declining. And when you begin to look at even other areas, here, for example, you can see India. You have a little bit of growth for a few more years, but then even countries like India that we come to take for granted have almost an unlimited supply begin to taper off. This is a century, in fact, when our total global population is expected to flatten out. This will be a very marked century in the history of the world, because demographers predict by about the middle of this century, the total world population will cease to grow, will flatten out. And toward the end of the century, we may actually begin to see a decline. Big implications for workforce and talent strategies. One other point I want to put quickly on the table to emphasize it is the numbers alone, of course, don't tell the whole story. Because there's a question of, are the bodies there? There's a second question of, do they have the skills you need for the workforce you're trying to build? And increasingly, the answer to that will be no. This is a schematic, kind of to give you a sense of the point, but more or less, the jobs we're creating in the US are like the blue pentagon. In other words, a lot of them require some higher level of educational capability. But the kids we're producing in the US are still very much like the green triangle. Many of them drop out of our educational process at very low levels. Did you know that the average dropout rate in the United States today is 22%? 22% of our children do not get a high school degree. Now, some go back later and get a GED degree, so it gets a little better. But basically, when they're 18 years old, we've got 22% of those 18-year-olds who don't have a high school degree. And I doubt there are many of you here in the room today that are building a workplace designed for high school dropouts. So big problems in terms of that mismatch issue. And the final number I'd like to throw out before we jump into talking about some of the specifics of how to make the best of each person is simply the reminder that we're all living a lot longer. So when we look at questions about the workplace, one of the big questions has to be, how do we take advantage of this growing population of healthy, active, intellectually capable older workers? The simplest way to change any of the charts that I've shown you about slowdown in the workforce growth is to add in people in their 70s. Those charts all assume that we drop out of the workforce at age 64. To the extent we extend them to age 70 or 75 or even 80, the numbers would look very different. We'd have a much different picture of the robustness of the workforce that's available.